Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glenberg channel. A strange music show where we take dives into the wonderful eclectic world of music and discuss a wide range of different things each and every week, right? So, of course, today we're returning to our dive into the discography of Swans, So in today's episode, we're actually looking at a very odd release indeed. An album that has been released a number of different times, in 1986, 92 and 1996. So we probably should have looked at this one a little bit sooner, probably around the sort of public castration era, but didn't get around to it then. So we're looking at it now in this sort of 92 era of things. So what we have here is another live document of the 1986 tour from Swans, another foray into the bludgeoning atonal world of miserably low and slow music, essentially, that forces you to suffer the onslaught that it constantly pushes along. I'm actually excited to discuss this one, as I really do enjoy this era of Swans, and returning it to it after sort of a long time of looking at the current albums we've been looking at, it's just been oddly delightful in its own weird way. Not a perfect album by any stretch, but one that I really responded to for some reason. So without further ado, I present Real Love by Swans. So, of course, what is Real Love? Well, this, for me anyway, is a rather confusing album within the Swans discography. So, originally released in 1986, this bootleg recording consolidated some recordings from the band's European tour from February to April in 1986. The release itself actually features very little information, and not even telling us who was in the band at the time of this recording, though we can most likely guess that it features pretty much the exact same lineup that appeared on Public Castration Is a Good Idea. So the original release in 1986 was pushed out by KSK on vinyl. A label that doesn't actually seem to have much of a footprint anywhere, and I couldn't find out much about them. According to the liner notes of the vinyl release, it does stand for Catatonic Swans Corpses, which is a very gnarly name indeed, I have to say. But whether this is something that was pushed out by Gira himself, or by some unknown people in the UK as a bootleg, it's hard to say exactly. In any case, though, this was then re-released in 1982 by Swans as well. Self-released on CD with the catalogue number of Love 2, before it then got re-released by Atavistic in 1996, which was also released on CD. Confusing to me, but at the same time, this is actually a very cool release within the Swans discography. A very overlooked album from the early atonal years, most likely in part to its similarities to the very revered album Public Castration Is a Good Idea, of course. Both albums feature very similar track listings, with Castration arguably having a much heavier and grittier sound. Here, everything is arguably a bit more lo-fi, with the music struggling to emerge from this incredibly dark, gloomy atmosphere. And yet, I kind of think that it arguably works well, and works well in its favour, essentially. Because what we end up having is an incredibly dark and depressing album experience, one that just drags you along through the misery itself, like the continuing aftermath of horrific suffering and terror. And I've been very surprised by this entire release, and it seems to have actually ranked higher in my personal ratings than I originally thought it would. Maybe it's because I had low expectations coming into it, but, sometimes that's just the way, and sometimes it does a tribute to these things. But, yeah, weirdly enough enjoyed this one, so let's dive in. So, opening up with Coward. The opening is one of this lo-fi percussive beat that slowly opens with this very invasive and bludgeon of sound when the rest of the instruments come in. There is a semblance of a bass guitar and an electric guitar hidden within the mix, but rather than sound like instruments, they kind of sound like snarling beasts, just roaring with such violent ferocity. The tempo is just so agonizingly slow though, like the effect of pure suffering, just being repeatedly bashed over the head, beaten further and further into this bloody pulp. And after a very lengthy introduction, you just get this very monotoned and low-end vocal from Jira just coming through, bleakly stating the visceral lyrics like they were facts. Stick a knife in me. I'm worthless. And so on and so forth. And it all just contributes to such a bleak and ugly landscape, one that feels very intimidating as it digs right under your skin, infesting it with the crawling of so many different bugs. There is something oddly phenomenal about this though, especially as you've got that electric guitar just whining in the background, but it's a brilliant effect that actually stands high above the rest of the instruments in terms of the mixing, as the procession just continues, just pushes all along with that miserably slow tempo. And before long, Jira's vocals turn from those, statements of fact into just this frantic shrieking. And it's like the track has navigated itself to this horrific, boiling point, essentially. As an opening track, there's something very fantastic happening here, I have to say. And it is just wonderful hearing this era of Swans that established the band so brilliantly in those early years. With how much we have been currently sort of diving into the 90s eras of Swans, it just feels like we're listening to a totally different band, going back and listening to this version of them. Because as opposed to the sort of 90s era that we've been currently looking at in the more recent videos, here we have none of that refinement in their sound, none of the polishing of the ugly layers to reveal the macabre nature of everything. Here, everything is just so horribly ugly and atonal, and I think it is brilliant for that. It's just such a violent and ugly vibe that feels very disturbing, yet there's something amazing about experiencing it all. It just punishes you and never lets go for the entire duration. And yes, as mentioned, I think it's kind of cool coming back to this after all this time, though. Because this is the sound that essentially established the band. This ugly atonality where the instruments just roar and scream with their horrific low end. And embedded within it all is such disturbing, macabre imagery that really gets under your skin, especially when you're looking at the lyrics to this track. It really just is quite disturbing. Truly phenomenal, and a brilliant way to open up this entire album with this version of Coward. Amazing stuff. So moving along, we get the next track of Stupid Child. So here the drums just smash away as the guitars just attempt to pull themselves out of the effects of being beaten down by those percussive hits. The distortion rising up like a miasma as the bass joins along each and every beat from the drum, it seems. And it once again paints such an ugly picture, which Jira just runs with as he groans so slowly over the top of it all. And what we have is just this agonising set, just pure misery and agony as the instruments just scream and shout, just falling apart at the seams as we get this phenomenal vocal performance from Jira. There's such an intensity here again, though. This sense of it just delving deep into this uncomfortable level of the human psyche and presenting it all in such an ugly and ferocious way. And I personally find myself enthralled by the entire thing, just in awe of how intense the entire thing is, just never once letting go of that atmosphere, even for a single second as it all progresses along. The entire thing is all just so agonizingly slow. It's what makes it so punishing and brutal, I find. But there's something truly phenomenal about it as well, when they just bring it all to such a monolithic crawl. I think for me, this actually comes across as one of the more stronger tracks on the album as a result, just a perfect representation of how miserable and depressing those early years of Swans could sound. Anguish screaming, atonal instruments just whining with this discordant feedback, and such an aggressively slow tempo from the drums. And it all just seems to go along for such an impossibly long time. Even well after Jira has finished the lyrics, you just get this miserable procession for the band continuing that dirge, continuing that slow push of the tempo. That loud, whiny, noisy feedback and deluge that is kept so rigidly by those drums. It's an impactful composition, but I think it's perhaps the actual ending itself, though, when we get something rather special, An a cappella repeated refrain of the word helpless, called out into the void as it is accompanied only by silence itself. And it's like Jira has just transformed and contorted into this ugly physical being before our very eyes, just curled up, crying and whining with all eyes upon them. Truly brilliant, and without a doubt one of the best tracks off this album, I feel, I don't know why, but listening to this one for this review, it just really got to me, and I couldn't help but just be swayed by the entire experience that the band was offering, this constant punishing anguish in the form of this horrible music. Truly brilliant, and a phenomenal version of this track. So our next track is Anything For You. So I can remember this one actually being one of my favourites from, about most of the albums I've heard it on, I think. Especially on Public Castration, I would say. So this one opens up with a very intense beat from the drums and this horribly angular stab of bass, accompanied by such horrible dissonance from the guitars. The tempo feels very akin to everything we've had thus far, but there's something that feels oddly even more intimidating about this version, even more ferocious and full of this really dangerous and intimidating energy. And after a couple of rounds of this really horrible angry bar in the music, Jira just comes in with that miserable drawl, just moaning away this horrible imagery of that physical relationship and the control present within it, essentially. Very disturbing without a doubt. But even though this one is so horrible and overbearing, truly ugly and reprehensible, it's without a doubt one of the strongest tracks from the whole album again. And a reminder of just how powerful this era of Swans was, in terms of how impactful their music is. It's the whole song just continues to be pushed along by that slow monolithic drum beat, accompanied by such horrible low ends swimming around in those lo-fi effects that add so much more grit and terror to it all, whilst Jira is just bellowing from the very depths of his being, just getting louder and louder the more the song all goes along. And it becomes so phenomenally overwhelming, just so intense and terrifying as you find yourself in awe of the horrible spectacle before you. And this incredibly ugly representation of physical love in this, this dominating context, essentially. There's a very gross element to it, and it really gets under my skin. It's something that makes me feel rather sick to my stomach, I should say. But I think it's probably because of the stark nakedness of the lyrics themselves, just the way it's so direct with everything it's saying. But I am amazed by it all as well, hence why this has always been one of my favourites from this era of Swans. This track just sets out to disturb the audience, and it perfectly captures that aesthetic, both in its content, but also in how it sounds, how it just pounds away with this very industrial monolithic aesthetic. I do have to say, it's without a doubt one of the best things in this album, the whole aesthetic is one that's so phenomenally ugly and horrible, witness to something so disgusting that you just want to turn away from it all. And the performance here seems to really draw so much from the ugly nature of the song itself, capturing it so much better than the album counterpart, which did do a grand job. But upon reflection, it doesn't really have enough of that horrible atonality to just sort of bring it all home that we have here on this live version. Looking back on the old reviews, I actually don't think I discussed how visceral and ugly the whole song was, or is. It has always been a favourite of mine, as I mentioned, but I do wonder, am I finding it, in this particular version all the more disturbing because of this particular performance? Part of me seems to think so, as there is something about this particular version of the track that seems to emphasise the true dark nature of the entire aesthetic, essentially. Still presenting it as a very bludgeoning and uncomfortable experience, but one that feels so much more darker and sinister just through how it's all been presented here. And I think as a result, it's definitely elevated the entire experience for me in terms of this album itself, And I think it's without a doubt one of the true highlights of this whole album, Even though I think I've said that for every track so far, which is very stupid, but it doesn't surprise me, to be fair, because I do adore this early era of Swans. And hearing it again on this album is just so oddly delightful in such an oddly disturbing way. But this one truly stands out to me with just how, ugly and dark the whole thing is. And a wonderful reason why I actually think this album is probably worth checking out. It doesn't really hold a candle to the, the violence that you get from Public Castration, I would say. But the depressing nature of it all is something that really gets to me on this one, and I think it is truly fantastic as a result. To get back to the album, Vinyl Owners flips to side B, and we find ourselves listening to Money is Flesh. So here, everything once again sounds so lo-fi and ugly. You just get that bass playing the first two notes, leading the way for the bludgeon of atonal noise from the rest of the band. And it establishes that very industrial tempo, before you get this weird rush across the drums, or maybe it's some kind of other percussive element here, and it creates this very uneasy sense of tension, before the guitar from Westberg just comes in with this wonderfully elongated distortion, just cutting through the beats like a buzzsaw, adding to the incredible atmosphere of everything. And with the beats, those beats, the discordance and the tone from the guitar, though, it just feels like being in the middle of a factory, just watching the machines churn away, producing more capitalist products for you to consume, one after another, over and over and over again. I think it's a brilliant opener to this song itself, and it just leads the way for Jira to just come in with those disturbing vocals once again, just whining and crying with this experience of dominating someone again, basically, very similar to the previous track, right? Once again, though, there is something so wholly ugly and reprehensible about it, so distressing as it just continues to bludgeon you over and over the more it all occurs, never once giving respite as it continues that established industrial tempo. And it seems, to me, the sort of bootleg quality of the recording, perhaps, this is something we see on a lot of sort of lo-fi albums, perhaps. And somehow that kind of quality of recording, it kind of works well for what they're producing in terms of the music, I would say, in this context, especially in these early years, because it seems like with everything having this lean towards these slower tempos, and emphasizing certain hits by having the whole band come in at the same time, it's weird, but that sort of lo-fi aesthetic kind of just adds to the overall vibe of it. Weirdly enough, though, this thing of the band just all coming in at the same time on these specific beats, it's the kind of things you kind of hear when you consider the later albums during the post-rock eras. But we will get to discussing those when we eventually do, of course. Here in this era, in the late 80s. Everything just remains sonically fascinating as a result, as it's just one ugly hit after another, just battering away beat by beat, with everything just atonally screeching with this horrible murky bed of lowercase noise, essentially. Like, weirdly enough, I'm often reminded so much of the kind of experience Jira would have had when working in New York on construction jobs, actually. This is something that comes up a little bit here and there in the sort of the 80s era. And as he has said himself, a lot of sort of parallels can be made between the work that Jira did with this sort of oppressive figure, one towering over you as you become beaten down by manual labour, just pushing your body through work constantly over and over. It does kind of make sense why so much of the music here just feels so overwhelmingly oppressive, like a constant percussion of hammers beating down as you repeat the same motions over and over and over. And it's why I think the sort of cosmic miasma a lot of the songs achieve works so well here, a result of it all being born from this sort of swinging motion back and forth between low end and discordant elements. Especially towards at the end of this particular song, Jira seems to have just transformed his vocal from tangible lyrics, to one of just grunting away over and over as the movement continues constantly, essentially. And I find it all sonically fascinating and a very captivating part of this set, one that overwhelms with its truly oppressive nature, really capturing so much of what makes this era Swans so fascinating to hear. Like, the music itself, it just swings back and forth, with the band finding this singular moment of miserable low ends to emphasise as it swings between it, against a moment that seems to add a bit more abstraction, perhaps, with the, just as the band sort of climb up the notes rather than hanging around the low ends, essentially. With, Jira just gluing it together with his vocals, I would say. That is until he's even unable to even continue, as the band just continues that constant structure right until it all just tapers off towards the end. Like, I don't know why, but I'm kind of just amazed by the whole performance here, and I think this might be one of my favourite versions I've heard of Money is Flesh. Like, I feel like back in the early days of reviewing Swans music for Weird Music, covering this era, we did get a few versions of Money is Flesh, the first version that appeared on Greed. You kind of had this constant repetitive industrial sound broken up by these, stabs on some kind of brass instrument. And I've never been sure why, but I don't think I particularly like the brass sections or whatever they are. It's the same on Holy Money as well. Like, even that version has a kind of brass vibe to it as well, like on the second version. But although I'm not a fan, they do kind of capture the sort of capitalist venture of the album's cover art, but I feel like, to me, they kind of detracted from the brutalist nature that the track is trying to offer here, especially in these live settings, actually. As mentioned, it's the same thing that happened in the rework for Holy Money, although the Holy Money version worked a little bit better than the version we heard from Greed, at least in my opinion. Basically, both studio renditions of the track kind of miss that kind of bludgeoning atonality that these live renditions offer, though. Because it's with these live versions, everything just ends up being so horribly atonal and ugly. And listening to it, you can kind of, get lost within the music itself. And you've got this amazing pendulum effect that occurs in so much of Swans' music, going back and forth between the actions, leaving hits just growling, whatever words he can manage to push out, essentially. And it makes for such a formidable performance that drags the composition in this really unsettling, visceral place. Like the body just tearing itself apart. And it's weird because I didn't really rate the tracks all that much on the studio album. Like on Public Castration, the song certainly seemed to open up and make a lot more sense to me. And on this version, I seem to really be enjoying everything that's going on here. Like, there's just something distinctly just ugly about everything occurring here. Just really leaning into that atonality at times and continuing that constant bludgeoning assault with each and every hit. Landing so nastily upon everything in that amazing swing that the band achieved with the music. And I don't know why, but something about it just makes it one of my favourite versions of the song. Like, I enjoy what it does in Public Castration, especially in terms of opening up the entire album as it was. But here, everything feels so much more discordant, perhaps, much more lo-fi and horrible. And the place they bring it all to, in that final agonising crawl, just feels so weirdly fascinating to me. Like, what weird stuff Swans were doing in this era of the band, right? And I have to say, it's stuff like this is why I really enjoyed looking into this album, essentially, because it's just fascinated me more than I ever thought it was going to. This incredible assault of music across these tracks, the perfect capturing of that live aesthetic from that era, in this very raw and visceral way that, is just tuned down to such horrible places. Definitely amazing, and without a doubt, a really cool artifact within Swans' discography, and an amazing track in this album, I have to say. It surprised me how much I've enjoyed this, essentially. But let's move on. We did spend a lot of time talking about that one. We do get the next track of A Hanging. So once again, we have that swing effect, the band and the drums landing on that low end, followed by a brief interception of a few fills on the drums. And most of that emphasis seems placed on that very first instance. This horrible bludgeon, that industrial beat, that just dragging down materials through these horrible machines, essentially, as you kind of get lost in this weird rhythmic structure that it's all doing, just looping over and over and over as your mind drifts from element to element in the music. From the drums to the bass, the guitar, and back and forth again, until a sudden pause brought with a sudden dum by the drums, a brief fill of two singular notes, it feels, before all coming back in again with that swing following that very brief interjection. It's weird, such a weird structure, but it's very cool. But what I adore is that you can just really hear Westberg's guitar screeching away as the structure just becomes so sonically fascinating, as he just lets the feedback evolve into these discordant delusions. The drums and bass just continue that rhythmic structure, still continuing to repeat that weird little fill-in again here and there. And it's so weird sounding, it's put you in such an odd place sonically, it feels like you just can't take anymore. And that's when Jira just comes in with this long drawn-out moan, a drawl crooning away the lyrics. And it's without a doubt one of the most sonically fascinating things off this album, though. I'm just finding myself in awe of how weirdly great it all sounds in this lo-fi way. The way Westberg lets that guitar fall deep into the recesses of droning distortion before silencing for that double hit from the drum and bass, before repeating all over again. Like, there's something very cool about what they're all playing here. And it's weird, but it's weird because you can really get instances of every member like just shining in this particular composition for some reason. They all just have their little moments, from Aldridge's bass part to, well, it's either Ted or it's Ronaldo doing the drums. It's hard to know exactly, but that weird beat they're doing. But you even have some very cool stuff from Jarbo occurring on this one as well. Like, her layers do... it's evident at this point on the album that her layers on the entire thing are very much buried within the mix, you know, a sad, unfortunate effect of the bootleg recording quality. But she clearly adds so much to the ambient vibes when all of the instruments come in, you know, adding in the urgency of it all as it just comes in for that singular beat, just filling up the songs with the deluge of droning notes it feels. And I think it's without a doubt one of the coolest things on this recording. There's something that sounds so weirdly brilliant with how the bands are all playing it on this particular version. Like, we've also reviewed this one a fair bit as well, I'm sure. Like, it cropped up on both Holy Money and Public Castration, but I don't remember it sounding this formidable though. Like, it's almost so much more slower on this one than even on the album version, which is without a doubt so sonically different from the version we have here. Especially, you know, with those backing vocals from Jarbo in the original, like, leaving it absent on these live versions, it kind of just drags the song into that sort of atonality once again. And it's almost like the album version is a fair few of these songs actually. It had a lot of polishing in the studio, whereas on these live versions, all that's left is just the vibe that ends up being produced by the effects of the live show itself. And on this album, the whole aesthetic from track to track just seemed to navigate this area of brutal atonality. Like, I think as a result, it draws out so much of this song that I find to be fascinating and so much more interesting than the album counterparts, you know? Like, I did enjoy the version from Holy Money, but I think I prefer this version because it does some really weird things, especially as a result of that very weird structure that they're all opting for. Like, a little bit unexpected, but an overall sense of brilliance from the horrible aesthetic the whole band is pushing forth. No, definitely a result of what they're all doing, essentially. It should be said, though, roughly midway, the whole thing just seems to accelerate, you know, just suddenly pushed along by the drums as it builds to a more fervent pace. As then the guitar lands between those two singular notes, and then the bass backing off for a few moments, for leaving room for this very weird a cappella section from Jira crooning away over the drums. And you wonder what they're even doing here, like where they're even going with this, as the drum just continue to push along that singular beat for such an impossibly long time. Perhaps envisioning the unnamed person approaching the very noose itself, you know, its eye drawn to that circular hole that is even represented by the name of the track and the very album cover itself, perhaps. It's weird because the drums play on for such a bizarrely long time here, and it leaves you in a state of constant anticipation, you know, just rising your heart and just setting along that tempo. And you're just constantly wondering where it's all leading, only for it to just play right along into nothingness itself as it just draws it all to a close. Truly brilliant, and my goodness, what a song from this album. Like, definitely a highlight in terms of how weird this one is. So we then move on to our final track here. We get Sealed in Skin. So this is actually the only track that didn't also appear on Public Castration. And as it also turns out, this is a song we haven't reviewed yet on the channel. This song was released by the band, but it only actually appeared in the Time Is Money Bastard single as a B-side. Very cool stuff. So for this version, very different to the version that appears on that single release, essentially. We kind of have a weird frequency opening up this one, hovering in place like a swirling light before the bass accompanies it, leading the way for this very slow bounce between these two moments, you know. A higher part, countered by that much lower section that follows it. And from there, it just goes back and forth, in and out like this weird pendulum effect once again. And there seems to be a bit of emphasis on the keyboards here from Jarbo, at least I think so, you know, with everyone essentially just following that monolithic crawl being established by the drums and the bass. And before long, you of course have that incredibly low-end drawl from Jira, just dragging each and every word through the mud itself, through guts and viscera left by the assault that this album has provided. And the song itself seems to kind of capture the oppressive and submissive concept once again, prevalent in a lot of the songs that Jira was writing and performing at the time, you know. And it resulted in just this incredibly slow, doomy crawl, you know, one that just continues to wallow in the darkness and depths that all the music is offering, as Gira just continues to bare himself before the audience, groaning miserably away, essentially. So weirdly fascinating, and I find myself just captivated by how grumpy and miserable the whole thing is, and how it's captured that aesthetic across every track on the album. As this track builds, though, it does get to some very fascinating places, because it seems the more it all occurs, the more the instruments seem to fall into traps, laid by delay and distortion effect, creating even these moments of brief interference in the form of, higher frequencies even at times. And it remains another cool performance that does that thing of building from the groundwork of the structure provided by the drums mostly, that very slow monolithic industrial crawl, into this area of feedback and chaos from the other instruments, even with that same regimented structure that is strictly keeping that time throughout the entire song. And with Jira just howling away constantly throughout it all, you find yourself so beaten down by the effects of the music, that oppressive nature that's often such a distinct part of the music that Swans makes. But I'm just amazed at how brutal it all sounds here, with there being this odd sort of lo-fi clarity to the whole album, it feels, even with that distinctly bootleg quality. It's weird to think about, as there has been a fair few albums we've looked at from Swans, albums like Anonymous Bodies in an Empty Room, where that sort of bootleg lo-fi quality that recording offers didn't add anything to the music itself. But here, in the 80s era, it seems to add so much more to the music, with everything just falling in amongst these sort of sonic walls of dissonance, especially with those lo-fi effects as a result of recording it this way. It just seems to work with this sort of weird bludgeoning atonality that the whole band provides. I do have to say, it's without a doubt a fascinating release within the Swans canon, though. I have been interested in coming into this one, because as I've mentioned, I do like the atonality of the early years of Swans music. The current era we've been looking at had definitely been very fascinating, so this 90s era, where we've looked at Love Is Life, Omniscience, and all the other albums in that era. So coming back to an album that returns us to the sonic oppression of Swans in the early 80s is just really amazing, and I think that might be why I've responded so well to it, because it's kind of just being something a little bit different in what we're looking at, maybe, perhaps. You just have that constant swinging back and forth effect in the music, and it just lets this sonic wall of dissonance build up for mere moments before falling back once again. And yes, of course, with it being sort of a bootleg lo-fi recording, the quality is perhaps a bit lacking here, but I think there is still some brilliant parts evident in these recordings, because it makes the whole thing come across as a large machine churning out disgustingly fleshy food and packaging and canning it all, bringing with it all that screeching atonality of scraped metal and squishy body parts with it. I have just found myself really vibing with how this album sounds, just completely bludgeoning you over and over again as it all occurs. And it's weird because it doesn't sound as good as other albums of its era, but I have found myself just really surprised by how much I've enjoyed everything here. I had a feeling in my mind that this would be a neat one to return to review and look at, especially looking at the era we've been looking at. And I am a bit disappointed in myself that we didn't cover it any sooner, but as mentioned in the beginning, I never knew where to place this album in the chronological releases by Swans, as it was originally a bootleg that then got a semi-official release during this era we're looking at currently, and then got re-released again. It just confuses me a bit. But irrespective, though, I do think it's very neat. And I feel like it's kind of reminded me of why those early years of Swans were so fascinating to me, especially in that live context, of being able to hold an audience in that place for such an agonizing length of time. It's resulted in an album that I just find really fascinating within the Swans discography, and it might genuinely be one of my favourite things sourced from the 80s era. The particulars of these performances themselves results in something I find to be truly spectacular. an experience that feels so bleak and overwhelming as it occurs with its monolithic dirges. Definitely one of the most surprising and coolest things I think I've heard, and it has amazed me how much I've enjoyed it, essentially. Like, diving into this particular review was the first time I was able to really sink my teeth into what I was hearing, because I had played it a fair few times here and there, but never really sat down to listen to it until writing down my thoughts about it, and it just surprised me how much I enjoyed it, essentially. Of course, this era of Swans isn't everyone's cup of tea, as we know full well. Like, some people prefer the late 80s, some people prefer the 90s, some people prefer the 2010s era, but I think it's kind of a testament to how brilliant Swans are as a band. You know, that they have all of these different versions of the band Swans, and they all have their own strengths and merits. And something I hope is expressed by simply coming across each album as we do on this show, is just to, highlight just how brilliant they all are in their own right, essentially. Like, each album just offers something distinctly of its own, essentially. And this one is no different as a result. Like, something I could just really get behind for some reason. Like, I don't truly know why. Like, it might be because we've kind of dropped into this era after such a long break from it, and maybe that has counted for something. Maybe also my kind of low expectation of it. Like, I thought I would enjoy listening to it, but I didn't have much high hopes because a lot of the live albums just haven't been that interesting, arguably. They've been cool, but they haven't been amazing, essentially. And therefore, I think this one just really surprised me as a result. So maybe that's why I liked it more. When you have low expectations, you tend to enjoy things more, but my fault. But regardless, I'm really glad we have covered this one on the channel, and it's been just fascinating to dive into. And so with that, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. I'm very glad to have covered Real Love by Swans, a fascinating little document that is, of course, so rightly overshadowed by the sonic experience that Public Castration is a good idea, of course. It has to be said, Public Castration is such a well-revered album within the Swans canon, right? The first live album, an aggressive and overwhelming experience to behold. But regardless, I have enjoyed listening to Real Love, as you know. What it kind of lacks for in aggression, it seems to make up for it in this absolutely bleak dissonance, just trudging along so slowly and agonizingly as it just pushes past this lo-fi experience of complete anguish and despair. And I think I liked this one more than I had any business liking, as it seems to just tick all the various boxes of what I like from the early No Wave era, right? Bludgeoning atonality. So yep, this is probably going to be another very polarizing episode of Weird Music, right? But it's fine. I don't think there's going to be all that many people who agree with my sentiments here, but it's fine because we all have our different opinions, and it is grand. I don't mind at all. And with a band as diverse as Swans, many of us are going to be inclined towards certain albums over others in different ways. Maybe it's because the Swans surprised me, as I've mentioned, but who knows. So, with that, I do hope you have enjoyed watching today's episode of Weird Music, though. Following the Discogs list of albums by Swans, we will be returning to the studio albums with a look at The Great Annihilator in our next video on Swans. Quite a formidable album, but I am looking forward to sinking my teeth into it. With that, I do wish you all the best. Take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye-bye.